Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, coming back to you with another Archon's Armory. This time talking about Dreadnoughts. We'll be keeping this one a little bit shorter, so let's roll right into it. Talking about the lore and mythos of Dreadnoughts. Now, a lot of the lore or mythos of Dreadnoughts is not all that difficult to disambiguate. There's a couple of confusions, a couple of conversations that need to be had, but let's start off with this. The eternal, the venerable, the best, all of this idea. The idea that only the absolute pinnacle of Astartes get put inside of Dreadnoughts, and that Dreadnoughts last forever. Now, this comes around because we know a couple of Dreadnoughts, especially examples from back in the Heresy, who have managed to stick around and remain relatively vital and capable of fighting well into the 41st millennium. Now, as a majority of our lore is based around the period before the opening of the Eye and after the Heresy, we will be talking about a few of these. Bjorn the Fell-Handed is one of the most commonly known, though there are some Heresy ones as well. Bjorn is one of the oldest Dreadnoughts available, but I would actually argue that he's not representative of what a majority of Dreadnoughts are. Now, it is obvious that a brand new Dreadnought, or a first edition Dreadnought, one who has been within his sarcophagus for only a short amount of time, and who may have been resurrected more out of necessity than out of his particular merit, that would not fall into this category of either the best, the venerable, or the eternal. Now you might ask, why are there not more Dreadnoughts around if just every old Marine can get put into a Dreadnought? I would actually argue that there's a pretty solid series of criteria that you need to meet in order to get put within the sarcophagus. The first one, and the most basic, is that you are damaged or wounded to a level that is recoverable. Now, this might mean that you are too far gone in order to have augmetics and other things fix what is wrong with you. The most reliable method would probably be to get both of your legs shot off, or sheared off, above the knee. Now, while that could be fixable with augmetics, you would no longer be nearly as effective as a Marine, and it would likely be a waste of resources to continue to try and keep you as a Marine, but without your legs, you can serve perfectly well inside of a Dreadnought. Now, walking coffin or war mech, this is another thing. A lot of the venerable dreads are walking coffins. While every Dreadnought has within it a Marine or other being that is specially modified to integrate with this machine walking tank vehicle, it isn't just the coffin. In some cases, the coffin is divorced from the arms and legs, and it can be separate, but it is definitely a combination of the two. It is meant to be an armored fighting vehicle that has legs and is controlled by a single, pretty much immortal pilot. However, at the same time, it is still prolonging the Marine's life. There are some examples where a healthy Marine manages to get inside of a Dreadnought, or Dreadnoughts are made that can use fully functional Marines, and we will talk about those. But understand that the average Dreadnought is a combination between this walking coffin that extends the life of a severely injured Marine and this war mech tank with legs idea of a developing war machine. The next one, Marines only. Now, it is pretty limited how many designs don't belong to just Marines. A majority of Marines within Dreadnoughts, as we talked about, are going to be immortal. They're going to be pilots until their bodies rot away or until they are killed. There are human Dreadnoughts. They do exist. And there are Dreadnought-adjacent vehicles that exist in various different forces, including the Custodes, the Sisters of Battle, proto-human Dreadnoughts do exist, and yeah, there are equivalents to the Dreadnought in other factions, but for the Dreadnoughts that we will be discussing today, a majority of them will be Marines only. Reproduction and design issues. Now, I don't mean reproduction of the Dreadnought in that way, I mean creating more Dreadnoughts. Dreadnoughts, interestingly enough, work more like vehicles than any of the armor that Marines use. The different sections, such as the arms and legs of the Dreadnought, are relatively simplistic as far as technology goes. They're not required to be all that complicated because the machine is relatively low to the ground. It's not doing a lot of quick, jerky motions. And unlike a knight, it doesn't have to be actuated and attenuated to travel at high speeds. It can pretty easily support its own weight and kind of plod along at a little bit above a fast walking pace. And that's probably about as fast as you'll get with a majority of standard dreadnoughts. There are much faster dreadnoughts, and we'll get to that. But in general, to reproduce the most basic version, the Castiferum, which are the examples down here, the classic dreadnoughts, as I like to call them, it's not all that hard to make new ones. They use fairly standard weapons and equipment that can be traded out and resupplied pretty easily. And even with all of their high-power systems, they don't need the big reactors or the minimized-sized reactors that you need for power armor. So they don't need a lot of that high technology because they can essentially put a tank engine into the back of the Dreadnought. So they can use an extant technological machine, the engine, it's a combustion engine, instead of any of the high-technology machinery that you put into power armor. So while the internals of it, the things that keep the Marine alive, are similar to a servitor's, a lot of the interchangeable bits and the replaceable parts and the stuff that gets swapped out and improved over time is pretty easy to reproduce. The issue comes in designing new dreadnoughts and improving upon the designs that exist. Now, most of the dreadnoughts that we have in the modern day in 40k are a handover from previous designs. There are a few that are modifications or reproductions with a few additions, but a vast majority of them are STC designs or partial STC designs from back in the Heresy. And there are a few that are no longer supported. Some of the Venerable Dreadnoughts and also some of the other designs like Dorado Dreadnoughts, Leviathan Dreadnoughts, they are no longer producible by the Imperium, which means that if you are in one, you're either going to have to be transferred to a new machine if it breaks down or is unrepairable, or you're going to have to stay with it and try and work around the issues that you have. So, Chaos Dreadnoughts versus Hellbrutes. This is another one that comes in for a good bit of questioning. The lore originally was that all Chaos Dreadnoughts had turned into Hellbrutes, but obviously that was completely ridiculous. Or at least it was claimed that all of the Traitor Legions that turned to Chaos had their Dreadnoughts transform into Hellbrutes. There is a stark difference between the Hellbrute and the Chaos Dreadnought. The really basic one is the Hellbrute is uncontrollable. The Marine inside of it, or the creature inside of it, you could argue, since it is no longer even recognizable to a degree as a Marine, as they're no longer sane, that creature inside of the Hellbrute is very much mad. It's psychotic. It is no longer a legionary. A lot of them were created during the Heresy. Essentially, a Marine who was inside of a Dreadnought was severely corrupted by the powers of the warp, or there was an attempt to possess them, and the result was that a demon or a huge amount of chaos corruption were co-inhabiting with this machine inherent connection with the Marine. This essentially, over time, liquefies the Marine's body and integrates it within the machine. This creates a machine that is no longer as maintenance-heavy as an actual Dreadnought that relies on, non-chaotic, actual mechanical means to function, but it also compromises a lot of its actual structure, and it makes it considerably less tactically useful because it's no longer a Marine controlling a tank. It is a mad, near-warp entity, hyper-corrupted creature inhabiting an armored fighting vehicle. Hellbrutes are just as likely to kill their allies on occasion as they are to help them, which is why when Hellbrutes are deployed, it's either with strict oversight from people who know the danger, or it's away from allied forces so that they can essentially spend their wrath, get tired out, black out, or be knocked out, and then taken back and reused. Hellbrutes can be reloaded with new Marines, but it's a little bit of a complicated process, and we'll go into that when we talk more about Hellbrutes and Chaos in general. On the other side, you have Chaos Dreadnoughts. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing one. There are Chaos Dreadnoughts who existed during the Heresy who did not fall to Chaos. Rylanor is a great example. But there are also ones who did. Malkarian, the War Sage, He is not Chaos corrupted. His body is still there. The Dreadnought that he inhabits is still functional, but he's on the side of the Night Lords after the heresy. He is definitely against the Imperium of Man, and he is absolutely set against his previous brothers. Now, Malkarian is a bit of an outlier, but I would actually argue that there are plenty of Chaos Dreadnoughts still extant post-heresy. Now, we don't see this often because Chaos Dreadnoughts are a rarity for the reasons that we'll talk about when we come to maintenance, but Chaos Dreadnoughts, like normal Dreadnoughts, the design for them, the basic Castiferum pattern, is fairly easy to replicate. I couldn't imagine a world where the Dark Mechanicus weren't capable of reproducing a Dreadnought of the Castiferum pattern and using it to save a Marine. The issue part here is Chaos Space Marines care a whole lot less about saving wounded Marines and a whole lot more about watching their own pocketbook. Because it is very expensive, obviously, to buy a Dreadnought from the Dark Mechanicum, it would be logical that less Chaos Dreadnoughts are bought, but they are definitely capable of being bought. So, for example, to give you a reference, if a Chaos Warlord was injured to the point of no longer being able to lead, it's questionable whether his followers would pick him up and be willing to inter him within a Dreadnought, where he could theoretically get more corrupted and turn into a Hellbrute, big problem, or he might be slipping in and out of consciousness. He will no longer be much of a leader if he's stuck within a Dreadnought, meaning that either way, somebody else is going to have to take over, and whoever that is probably more on the side of stomp on the previous warlord's head, kill him outright, take his gene seed, and continue to work as a regular Marine, disregarding the entire Dreadnought step entirely. But there are examples where that wouldn't be the case. My best example would be the Black Legion or the Reorganized Legions, who would have a perfectly good reason to save a Marine who was of some note or some capability, and put them within a Dreadnought that they could use later. And the last thing here is, are they tanks or are they mechs? I actually argue that the Dreadnought is a whole heck of a lot more like a tank than it is like a mech. I consider it more of a walking tank for two reasons. One, it's very heavily armored on almost every portion of its body. So, while mechs can be heavily armored, they do tend to have a lot of attenuation, which means a lot of open spar metal and other materials showing. Dreadnoughts are created very small, very tight to the central body, and with very limited ranges of motion and very limited caps on their speed. In addition, the way that they're utilized and used is mobile heavy weapons support. They are a well-protected, very well-armed support unit, more than anything else. And while I respect the idea that they are ambulatory, they have legs rather than treads like a tank, there's nothing to say that their employment has less to do with their designation than their actual design. Now, I fall down on the side of tanks just because of things that we'll talk about later with how they're actually employed, but it is perfectly reasonable to say that because they are controlled like a mech, they are more mech-like. But again, we'll talk about that when we come to control surfaces. The reality of Dreadnoughts. This is going into a lot more detail with them. And I apologize. Some of these pictures may be grainy. I picked them out a little bit late. So the Dreadnought concept, again, it's this idea of almost a philanthropic end. A Marine, whether he be a hero or whether he be a new recruit who is a lost cause. He's been injured so badly that the real good thing to do would be to mercy kill him. Like, Marines can't afford much of the time, loyalists that is, can't afford much of the time to just kill their own brothers. It's a very, it's a very disgraceful, very disgusting idea to a loyalist to have to murder their own brother. Now, putting down a Marine who's going to die anyway, that might be a thing that they could stomach. But killing a Marine who has a chance to survive, even if it's just as a Dreadnought, I would find that very, very hard to stomach for most Loyalist chapters. Obviously, for Chaos, it's a lot less of a question. It's more of a risk-reward type of thing. But the Dreadnought concept is essentially, there are lots of injuries that a Marine can have that will keep them from being a Marine ever again, but they are not going to die of them. And thus, the Dreadnought is an honorable way to go. It's an honorable death, quote-unquote, that makes them no longer a Marine, but now has created a new brother for the chapter. Not to mention that a Marine inside of a Dreadnought is relatively safe. He's going to be able to continue functioning where he wouldn't have normally if he didn't have the Dreadnought. So, why are Dreadnoughts so rare and rarely used? Now, we talked a little bit about it on the Chaos side. While they are capable of making them, most certainly, especially the Castaferum pattern, which is very common, they don't want them to turn into Hellbrutes. But the reason why they're so rare among the Loyalists is for two reasons. We never see them, not because they're not there, but because they haven't yet been needed. So, Dreadnoughts are called in when a fight is going against the Marines, but not so far against them that they think they're going to lose. So it's a very specific situation where you have a Dreadnought on hand, and this venerable, honorable brother is awake, ready to fight, and he's of enough, usefulness, his weapons and equipment are of the right type to make a difference here. So that is a very specific set of circumstances in which a Dreadnought is going to be dropped down on the battlefield. Now, you might say there's a lot of situations where a Dreadnought would be helpful. Yes, but the chapter loves its Dreadnoughts. They really do. They put a lot of time and effort into them. The Dreadnoughts, as we see, will have a lot of effects on morale. They massively affect the chapter's standing, because having more venerable brothers is a very good thing for, recognition. But they keep these warriors very close to the vest. They're concerned about their deployment. So the reason that they're so rarely used, and why we so rarely see them, is because the situation in which they're going to be deployed is pretty uncommon, and even then they're going to be carefully deployed and probably be brought back at the earliest possible convenience. The other thing is we see them deployed in larger numbers when the chapter, or in the case of some units, the Legion, is in danger. Now, if a chapter homeworld were being invaded, you could expect 10 or more Dreadnoughts to be deployed. And why is that? Very simply because if the Dreadnought is taken unawares, if he is in his mounting ceremony, or if he's in storage, because when not in active combat, Dreadnoughts are put in storage. If he's in storage, that's a brother that you're going to lose automatically because he can't fight back. If the Dreadnought is caught unawares, if he isn't outfitted with his equipment, which he doesn't sleep with for the most part, if he's not outfitted with his equipment, he's a guaranteed loss. You can write him off because he cannot fight back. And any damage to him internally is probably going to spell his end, regardless of how good the Dreadnought is. So, that's why. If there's a situation in which where they're sleeping, their kind of tomb is endangered, they'll be deployed. But if it's a situation where, well, it's not a necessity that we get the Dreadnoughts out of storage, or all of our brothers are sleeping right now and it might be dangerous to bring them back up to readiness, then the chapter will probably forego the Dreadnoughts. Heavy weapons in a fully mobile, durable platform. Now, this is when I go back to the tank analogy, how they are more of a mobile, armored support unit. For example, you see a lot of Marines with a ton of specialty equipment, right? You see them with meltas, plasma, heavy anti-infantry weapons, things of that nature. You don't often see Marines carrying things like super heavy melee weapons. It can happen, there are examples of it, but it's not a common thing. You wouldn't expect a regular tactical squad to be running around with a Thunderhammer. Or you wouldn't expect a regular tactical squad to be running around with something like an assault cannon or dual heavy bolters. The Dreadnought can keep up with his brothers on foot. They're going to have to slow the pace for him a little bit. But if they, keep to a more of a jog rather than a run, the Dreadnought will be able to waddle along after them. I love Dreadnought runs so much. They're adorable. But if they do that, they can have those support weapons on demand in a platform that is as armored or better armored than most of their tanks. So, for the cost of one Dreadnought being deployed to the theater, you could make up for 2 armored vehicles almost, because they have 2 different weapon mounts. So it is a lot of ability in a small platform. So a lot more like a heavy support weapon on legs than a mech or some sort of big centerline unit. Heavy armor versus mobility dreads. Now, this gets into the design aspect, and in my opinion, like with Terminator armor, there are two versions of Dreadnoughts. There are Dreadnoughts that take the design of something like a Knight or Armiger and then squish it down to the size of a Dreadnought. And then there are ones that take the design of a Terminator and balloon it up to the size of a Dreadnought. Now, on the Terminator side, you get Castiferum pattern, the Redemptor patterns, some of those much larger, more heavily armored ones. The Redemptor is actually kind of arguable whether or which kind it is, because it's essentially just a Ven Dread that you've put more armor on and given an extra joint in each limb. But regardless, the two kind of sliders for the Dreadnoughts is how much armor and weaponry you want to put on them. You know, on the very heavy side, you have kind of the super heavy Dreadnoughts that have lots of heavy weapons and specialty weapons. And then on the other side, you have the more mobile Dreadnoughts who act a little bit more like a giant Marine. You know, they might have a melee weapon in one hand, let's say like a Lightning Claw or something, and this is very common with the Contemptor Dreadnoughts, which are some of my favorite. I call them the Runner or the Sprinter Dreadnoughts. They have one melee weapon and a pair of heavy bolters. And you can imagine the Marine inside of that Dreadnought feeling exactly like he used to when he was able to use his body. He has a bolt gun in one hand, granted, it's a twinned heavy bolter now, and he has his chainsword or his lightning claws in the other. Boom, he gets to pretend to be a Marine again. It's a very interesting dynamic there. I love the Contemptor for that very reason. The Dreadnought essentially gets to act like he's still one of his brothers, and not some venerable machine. But on the other side of the mobility dreads, you have those super heavy ones. So, fields, power, energy, and subsystems. Like I said, a majority of Dreadnoughts are powered by a more traditional engine. Obviously, it is big, obviously, it is complex, but it is much more in line with a tank's engine or a tank power pack than it is with a power pack for power armor or even Terminator armor. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. The big one is that the Dreadnought simply requires a great deal more energy than most other, even vehicles, light vehicles, the Dreadnought requires more energy for, because it has a lot of technological components. It has embedded subsystems like Auspex and also systems for its weapons to be powered. And furthermore, all Dreadnoughts, or a vast majority of Dreadnoughts, have a shield system. Whether this is the more arcane automantic shielding or Aegis shielding, which is from the Heresy and has been kind of reproduced in the modern day, but that is the more specialized version where it's designed to take a lot more damage. Essentially, it works more like an ion or void shield in terms of design, but not function. And then the more standard Dreadnoughts, they will be equipped with a standard refractor field, as we saw in Terminator armor, and this requires a great deal of power from the platform, and generally, because the Dreadnought is so large, it will only cover a short portion or a section of the whole Dreadnought. Usually, it's the containment around where the brother is located, so it'll be either in the front of his chest, or it'll be somewhere on the lid of his coffin, something like that. So that protective field requires a ton of energy, and it is different for different Dreadnoughts. Then Chaos Dreadnoughts and Hellbrutes. We already went over that a little bit, but the video subtext here is just in relation to, yes, Chaos doesn't really use Dreadnoughts as much for selfish reasons, but also Hellbrutes are super cool, and we will talk about them more later. So, I'm sorry this is a super grainy image, but it's a pretty easy one to find, so go ahead. Pros and cons of Dreadnought. So, protection versus mobility. This is one of the things. It sacrifices a lot in the name of protection. There are a couple of Dreadnought patterns that have more mobility, but a vast majority of the time, the Dreadnought is designed with much heavier armor in the point of protecting itself. So I would put that as both a pro and a con, because it's kind of a sliding scale. If you go too far towards mobility, you will be weakening the armor too much. But if you go too far towards protection, you become far less mobile and a lot slower. Weapons loadout, weight versus energy. So the weapons loadout for most Dreadnoughts usually includes a twin-barreled heavy weapon and a melee weapon. Now, there are some that are built with double melee weapons, some that are built with double ranged weapons, and we'll talk about that when we come to design. But the weapons loadout versus weight and energy actually matters a lot. Because the lighter Dreadnoughts need to be more mobile, they can't equip themselves with very heavy weapons. In addition, those that are very heavy require a ton of energy, so that energy is taken directly from the power pack. Now, if you're aware with certain power packs, there is such a thing as overpulling, where you can have too much energy load in the system, and when you discharge a weapon or you start to move while firing, you can cause problems with the power pack. You can cause energy shortings, you can cause overheating. Any of these problems can occur. Now, it is a bit of a balance. Obviously, you want to balance which weapons are more kinetic and which are more energy. And if you have a Dreadnought design that is very energy intensive, aka it uses very heavy shielding, or it uses a lot of mobility and it's needing to be on its feet running a lot of the time, you might want to get more kinetic weapons so that you don't have to draw energy from multiple locations. For example, powering a las cannon while also powering another las cannon on the other arm and powering a shield is going to put a dramatic strain on the Dreadnought's power reserve and might cause some issues. So there is a bit of a controversy there, but in general you'll notice that say a Contemptor isn't going to use quad las cannons. That's a lot of power load. Most Castaferum Dreadnoughts usually will have one ranged weapon and one melee weapon, but it's not unreasonable to say that if they had auto cannons on one hand and a missile launcher on the other, both technically kinetic weapons, it's not drawing too much energy. That's my point. Knowledge and intelligence. This is a massive pro. Sorry. This is a massive pro for the Dreadnought. The venerable Dreadnoughts, the ones that are really old, the ones that have been around since the Heresy or just after the Heresy, they have seen tens of thousands, if not millions, of battles. And they have probably killed enough enemies of the Imperium of Man that they could tell any would-be Marine or any commander that they're under more about them than they know themselves. So it would not be unreasonable, in my opinion, for a Dreadnought to see, like, Dark Eldar raiders, and while the captain next to him is like, ah yes, the Dark Eldar, I know about their race, and the Dreadnought just points over and goes, yeah, I know that guy by name, and I know exactly what cult he's part of. I know what they're gonna do next. And, you know, that might be shocking to a captain who's like, wait, I thought I was supposed to be the one in charge here. No, the Dreadnoughts know so much because they've been in the fight for that long. They are very intelligent. They have been around the block a million times, and they have nothing better to do than share that information with young Marines. It is a tradition in some chapters to have Dreadnoughts take younger Marines or, you know, leaders to be under their wing to give them information or to teach them. Sometimes it's to teach them patience, because on occasion Dreadnoughts can be a little bit scatterbrained. You know, eons in sleep mode will do that to you, but their knowledge is definitely a massive bonus to the chapter, and they act as a reliquary of knowledge. Rylanor, the Ancient of Rites, he's not the Ancient of Rites for no reason. He is knowledgeable, and as his venerable brothers would also be knowledgeable about the chapter's history. They would be knowledgeable about the heresy, about their Primarch. They would know how things are going. And the other thing is, Dreadnoughts can keep things from going off the rails. If you have a chapter master or a captain who's acting up, or there's some dispute within the chapter, it would not be unreasonable to go to the Dreadnoughts, to talk to the venerable ones, because while they might be easily distracted and a little bit sleepy, they were around when your first captain started the chapter. They were around when the Primarch might have been alive. They were around when the chapter master before you was in charge, and they could tell you exactly what he would have thought, because when he needed advice and help, they went to him, or they went to this Dreadnought or to this Marine while they were still a Marine. So, very important there. Morale buff. This is also a massive one. So, this is kind of goes from good to bad. On the side of pro, a Dreadnought dropping onto the battlefield is horrifying. If you're a Chaos Marine, seeing a Dreadnought is pretty much evidence that there's a significant Marine force on this planet arrayed against you, and even if you overcome the Dreadnought, there's a pretty solid chance that he has enough buddies to come and avenge him. Not to mention that you might actually not take him down for good. You know, you tried to kill him before, he might be back again. But for a Loyalist Marine to see a venerable brother drop down onto the battlefield, I know we've all seen the Skies of Baal, that animation with the Blood Angels and their Dreadnought. the feeling that you felt during that, watching that Dreadnought go offline for the last time, was the same feeling that most Marines would feel if a Dreadnought died. So, on the one hand, it's a super good morale buff, and it terrifies the enemy when they come down and they fight. If the Dreadnought is killed, it can either drive fellow Marines to be absolutely furious, which could cause them to make mistakes, but is also, you don't want to fight a pissed off Marine any more than you want to fight a regular Marine. But it could also cause them to break and retreat. If they lose a Dreadnought and their entire focus might be, okay, we need to get the Venerable Brother off of here so that the Chaos Forces or whatever forces can't despoil his body. Like, their very existence is a chapter relic, basically on its own, especially if they're a Venerable. If they're a Venerable Dreadnought, they've served a million battles, they were around when the Primarch was, there is no lengths that a chapter will not go to get their body back, basically. Like, they would probably be willing to sacrifice their own lives to make sure that that brother got back. So yeah, that's both a pro that can very rapidly become a con over a few seconds. Flexibility and speed. This is a con. While the Dreadnoughts can be made in a platform that is relatively speedy, or at least speedy by Dreadnought standards, they are not Armiger or Knight levels of quick, and they don't have the stride length of Titans. I would argue that they're probably a little bit faster, especially the Runner Dreads, the kind of Contemptor style. They're definitely faster than, like, a Terminator. But even then, their flexibility, their ability to spin, rotate, all of that stuff, especially flex downward, is severely limited. Some Dreadnoughts, for example, Castaferum, can rotate the entire coffin backwards, and can spin 360, but even then, it's like a tank's turret, right? It can't rotate up and down all that much. All it can do is move the arms a little bit. So, the flexibility of the Dreadnought is very limited, even in the more actuated versions, like the Contemptor, and their speed is very limited. So, any vehicle could probably outrun a Dreadnought, unless it was incredibly slow. So, they're definitely not the speediest of creatures, but yeah, they don't need to be quite often. So that's a con. Deployment and maintenance. Deploying a Dreadnought usually comes in two forms. They can be deployed from underneath aircraft, but that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. They can also be deployed via teleportarum. Again, dangerous, but I would argue not as dangerous as hooking them to the bottom of an aircraft. Look, I just don't want to have a random flak shell kill my Venerable Dreadnought. Look, if I'm being serious, I don't want to have them drop from 500 feet above Hive City either, because while they might survive that, their legs are going to be broken and we're going to have to go find them. The more common version is to deploy them via drop pod, or to deploy them the more traditional way by landing them on a planet with a spacecraft or with a large shuttlecraft, and then letting them walk to their destination. Because they don't need a ton of, supply in the field other than fuel, ammunition, etc. They're not as heavy as a tank. They're not going to require as much maintenance as a tank, but they are more complicated in terms of, the Marine inside could go into the next thing that we're going to talk about. But their deployment in general is definitely a bit of a con. While they may be but a single Marine, they take a lot more effort to get into the war zone than something like that, but they are a little bit less complicated to get into the war zone if you're willing to take the risk when compared to a tank. Speaking of maintenance is sleep cycles and willpower. So this is a thing that is very important with Dreadnoughts. When a Dreadnought is not in use, when it is not actively fighting a battle, it is detached from its limbs. Usually, it sometimes stays with its limbs, but not always. It's usually the preference of the Dreadnought. Hellbrutes are always removed from their limbs. And then they go into pretty much a sleep cycle. They essentially black out, or they slowly drift into kind of contemplative unconsciousness. They're not asleep. They're not unaware of things around them, but they can be very hard to rouse. Think of somebody who's very dozy, like you took a few too many Benadryl, and you're trying really hard to not fall asleep. That little in-between section between blacking out and being awake, That's basically like 80% of a Dreadnought's existence. They spend their entire time in this kind of narcotic-induced la-la land where their blood is being pumped full of gasoline and other stuff. Like a servitor, they're essentially kept alive medically and mechanically. But they're not really awake. They're not going to be conversational. You definitely would have to, knock on the Dreadnought a few times and be like, Brother, wake up. Brother, wake up. We need to ask you a question. And then they might wake up, see that the question is stupid, and then fall back asleep. But the big important thing about this is that while you could take a Dreadnought unawares while it's sleeping, they do have the ability to rouse themselves quickly when there is danger, and that comes into willpower. So, one of the reasons that Chaos doesn't use Dreadnoughts is because they have to be out of commission for a certain amount of time to go through the sleep cycles. And the second part is that willpower part. A Marine, and this applies for both forces, by the way, but it's really big for Chaos because, they want forces on hand all the time. A Marine who doesn't have the willpower to fight the contemplative unconsciousness, which gets stronger as they grow older, the Marines who don't have the ability to fight it, they're kind of permanently in that sleep cycle. And there are some Dreadnoughts that are kind of a lost cause. They're so old, they're so exhausted, they've been in so many fights that they rarely wake back up. And those are the ones who get put away in the chapter vault, and they just kind of sit there and dream for ages. I'm talking like decades at a time. And they might wake up every now and then, ask about some old Marine who died 100 years ago, and when some serf or acolyte tells them, Brother Cephas died like 4 decades ago on Xantax, and he'll just be like, alright, cool, I'm going back to sleep. But the willpower thing is important. Pulling yourself back out of the contemplative unconscious, pulling yourself back to reality, even if there's danger, takes effort. It takes willpower. The Marine has to focus all of their mental energy. They have to resist the effect of the drugs and or the mechanical systems keeping them alive, and they have to physically pull themselves back from unconsciousness to awakening. And now there are rites of awakening, and there are things that you can do to speed this up if you're going to deploy a Dreadnought, but the other thing that you can do, and this is something that happens with Chaos occasionally, for example with Malkarian the War Sage, he woke up after a very long time asleep, and what he said he woke up for was because a Terminator was trying to murder one of his brothers, and he woke up saying, I heard bolter fire. Where was it from? So, I heard bolter fire is a very good example of a Dreadnought being woken up, quote-unquote, by force. So when the willpower isn't there, they're not beyond saving, but you can wake them up by force. Endanger the sarcophagus, smack them upside the head, shock their systems. There's a chance that you might kill the Marine, there's a chance you might make them freak out and attack friendlies, so you don't want to do this, but when all else fails, and it's between the Dreadnought dying in his cell and the Dreadnought maybe dying due to the awakening, you want to pick the maybe dying due to the awakening rather than just leaving your brother to die with no help. Patterns and functions. This is going to be long because we're going to be talking about a lot of these. Now, Castaferum, or the Trad Coffin, is a Chaos or Imperial favorite. It is this kind of segmented 3-piece, kind of blocky, low-to-the-ground Dreadnought. It's got not even a knee joint, it's got like a half knee joint or a hip joint. And it is really one of the most common Dreadnoughts around. And the Castaferum mods, usually these are just modifications on the original version. The Castaferum you can always find just because it's going to look very blocky. It's going to have some sort of head or recessed helmet in a gorget. This, for example, is a very modified version of a Thousand Suns one. And I would even possibly call this a Castaferum mod. But a majority of these are protected by a very thick ceramite covering, covering up all of their mechanical bits, very similar to power armor. It is roughly equivalent to the armor on, say, a Rhino or any other Space Marine light or medium vehicle. So it's thick ceramite backed by steel. It's probably 2 or 3 times thicker than standard Marine armor, especially on the chest and the area surrounding the Marine's actual body. It's probably going to be between 4 or 5 inches thick, including the metal. So it might be 3 inches of ceramite and then 3 inches of metal, or it might be 2 inches of metal and 3 inches of ceramite. It tends to be more on the ceramite side. The Castaferum mods, the Siege is, it's also often called the Salamander Siege Dreadnought. It has a big heavy flamer and this rock grinder drill. I'm not going to be going into every single modification of Castaferum because there are a lot of them, and really the only thing that matters is the weapons that they're equipped with most often. You do also see a couple other versions of Castaferum. Some of them have a helmet, some of them have the flat coffin look that is also on the front of the Redemptor. But the Castaferum also has the Siege, the Ironclad, which will be on the next page. All the Ironclad is essentially takes these flat sections to either side of the coffin and covers them in extra protection and adds a couple extra weapons, along with an extra arm joint. The rank dreads. Now, rank dreads are kind of specific. They are dreadnoughts that have been modified due to the rank or the speciality of the marine who is inside of them. So, for example, a chaplain dreadnought is housing a chaplain. It will be in black, it will have the chapter symbol, and it will have a skull-type helmet, or it will have a skull motif on the front of it. Then Psychers. There are a lot of psychic dreadnoughts. This includes dreadnoughts that have magic powers from Chaos, but it also includes the more traditional, a librarian is severely injured, wants to continue fighting, and he is interred within a dreadnought, allowing him to be a Psyker dreadnought. Now, these are a little bit complicated because the Thousand Suns have these as well. Some of them exist within Chaos, but they are uber extreme rare because Psychers tend to not die all that often for Chaos, or when they do, their bodies are not recoverable. So, these Psyker Dreads, they are pretty powerful because they're old, but they are also dealing with a lot of different issues. Their bodies are definitely modified, and they're not at one necessarily with the warp as they used to be. There are also chapter-specific modifications to the Castaferum, along with special modifications to them. So, for example, there are dreadnoughts that are specific to the White Scars, or specific to the, the Space Wolves, that have modifications that befit the chapter. Now, these are usually on venerable dreadnoughts that want to essentially pimp out their coffin to have a much better, organization, color scheme, design, weapons, whatever it may be, to make them feel more like a brother. A lot of the dreadnoughts feel depressed, or at least divided on how they should exist, because are they a battle brother anymore? They haven't really gained rank in the dreadnought other than the mythical status of being a dreadnought. So a lot of them have, some of them have mentioned the idea of like, all that I've done is die. Why am I given special status when I've failed? I've essentially been killed, and because of that, I'm given more respect? That doesn't make sense. But over time, their accolades and accomplishments can continue to increase as they are a dreadnought and continue to serve. But, moving on. Redemptor. Redemptor dreadnoughts are newer. They are essentially an updated Castaferum. It takes the central portion of the Castaferum and adds another joint to the arm, so it adds an elbow, or it adds a shoulder instead of just having an elbow to the armor, and it adds an extra knee joint. So the Redemptor is higher off of the ground. It has additional breastplate armor that protects the lower half of the container, or the lower half of the sarcophagus, and it can carry more and different weapons. We'll talk about a lot of the weapons in a bit. I call it the XL Castaferum because it is way bigger. It is essentially almost twice the size of the traditional Castaferum, and with that advantage comes a lot of disadvantages. It has a very strained and taxed power system. It definitely is not moving at any appreciable speed, and because of all the weapons that it totes and carries, it can be very overladen. So these are very heavy. They're definitely more in line with a heavy tank or a heavy vehicle. Almost you would call them a super heavy dreadnought, but their armor protection in a vast majority of places is not any better than a traditional dreadnought. They're just a little bit bigger, a little bit more limber, and have a bit more flexibility than the Castaferum, which is, Castaferum is one of the most basic, least mobile versions of dreadnought armor. The Contemptor, or the Runner Dread. One of my absolute favorites, and it's down here. I believe this is a Raven Guard Contemptor. The Contemptor I call it the runner because unlike most other skeins of Dreadnought armor, it has a secondary knee joint. Obviously, the Redemptor has this as well, but it is half the size of the Redemptor in terms of torso protection. So it is a lot lighter, its arms are more jointed, it has elbow and shoulder joints, and it has knee and thigh joints and waist joints, which means that it is able to literally run. It can ambulate at a higher speed, it can use its weapons with a lot more traditional force, and a lot more skill, rather than the kind of smashing, slamming mech combat of the Castaferum. The Contemptor can use much more dexterity, so to speak, because of its design. It's also a lot faster. However, it trades a lot of that for losing a good bit of protection. Obviously, the torso is a lot thinner. The protection is rounded, but it still has more weak spots than the Castaferum, which we'll get into. The Deredeo. Now, I call it the Dorito Gunrunner, because it is shaped like a Dorito. It is shaped triangularly. And it is almost always equipped with heavy ranged weaponry. Now, this is one of the designs that cannot really be reproduced by the Imperium. It is a very classic Heresy design, and I am a big fan of it, but it's not my favorite. Now, it has a lot of advanced systems, including its shielding system and its auspex, but it rarely has melee weapons. This is for a good reason. It's because it is pretty much without arms. It has a wide bulwark torso, almost like the front of a boat, but it doesn't really have that long of an arm reach, and it generally just has a shoulder joint onto which heavy ranged weapons are attached. So, while it is mobile, more mobile than a heavy weapons platform, it is not really capable of that, last-ditch or heavy melee combat that most Dreadnoughts are capable of, and so it trades that out for having much heavier ranged weaponry. So I call it the Gunrunner, or the Dorito Gunrunner. The Leviathan. The Leviathan, remember how I talked about, taking Titans down or taking Terminators up? The Leviathan is if you took a Terminator and crossbred it with an Imperial Knight. The Leviathan is enormous. It is kind of an inspiration for that old-fashioned, or that, fan-made Sauterine armor. It is wide shoulders, very broad, on par in size with the Redemptor, and carries archaic weaponry. Not archaic as in bad, archaic as in archaeotech weaponry. I'm talking gravity weapons from back in the Heresy. I'm talking large Volkite weapons, in addition to other heavy weapons. But unlike the Deredeo, which can't use melee weapons, the Leviathan can. So the Leviathan is a little bit like the Redemptor before the Redemptor existed, and in my opinion, the Leviathan has a lot more protection than the Redemptor does, because it has old-fashioned, much stronger automantic shielding. So it is much more of that Terminator style of Dreadnought. It is mobile, not as mobile as the Contemptor, more mobile than the Castaferum, but very heavy and heavily armed. A lot of their weapons are also very special, and they can carry extra weapons along. A lot of them can, but the Leviathan has it built in. Now, specialty dreads. We'll talk about these in more detail in the next thing, but there are specialty dreads. There are custodian dreadnoughts that are very special. There's the Telemon, and then there are the more traditional dreadnoughts that are done up for the custodies inside of them. There are war suits. These are used by a lot of different forces, including proto-humans during the Great Crusade, during the Unification Wars on Terra. The Sisters of Battle now use war suits. The Marines use war suits. And Dread Knights are technically the war suits of the Grey Knights. While the Grey Knights do have traditional Dreadnoughts as well, they also use Dread Knights. So, pattern analysis continued. Speaking about these, this is kind of an old-fashioned Castaferum. It's got a little bit more modifications, Thousand Suns. Redemptor up here, we have a Hellbrute. The Hellbrutes seem to be kind of a combination between the old-fashioned Castaferum and little bits or sections from the Contemptor. We have a classic Contemptor down here with claws, rockets, and what looks like a heavy bolter in each hand. And then the Siege Dreadnought, the Siege Castaferum with its heavy flamer and rock grinder. Here we have a kind of prototype, or not prototype, but this is more of a homemade Custodes Dreadnought. Very cool. This looks very close to the Deredeo. So this looks like a Deredeo Custodian Dreadnought. So these are both Deredeo. This is the Dreadnought. You can see that it has more of shoulders for weapon mounts rather than it has anything else, and it mounts very heavy ranged weapons with good auspex and great shielding in their place, including chest weapons. Contemptors can be equipped with heavy anti-armor weapons like this one, the Telemon down here. This is an Ironclad. The Ironclad, like I said, kind of has a lot of added-on bolted weapons, in addition to having some kind of carisade or carriage weapons like these bolt arrays. Up here you have another Dreadnought, kind of the original Contemptor Custodes Dread. Has kind of a war scythe and a side Stormbolter. This is one of the OG Hellbrute designs. It has the Lightning Claws or the Power Scourge that is now a thing, but I actually think that these are very cool because they represent a different version of Dreadnoughts, where you have a Marine inside who is not yet a Hellbrute, but who's getting there. Essentially, it's a very heavily corrupted Chaos Dreadnought. This is, I believe, an image of Bjorn the Fell-Handed, might be another gentleman, but you can see he is in a, he's either in a heavily, yeah, he's in a I don't know if he's in a Castaferum. He might be in a Contemptor, but it's hard to see from this position. This is a very venerable Castaferum over here of the Ultramarines, and then this is the Leviathan. So the Leviathan Dread, you can see these are Volkite underneath its carriage. It has rockets and missiles up here, and this one has quad autocannons. So you can see the Leviathan and the Dreadnought have a ton of ranged weaponry, putting them on par with most heavy or super heavy tanks in terms of firepower. But they could also have heavy anti-armor weapons like the multi-meltas that you see here, and their melee weapons count as anti-armor weapons anyway because they are so darn big. This is one of the bigger slides. These are also kind of blurry, kind of shows cross-sections of the Dreadnoughts. Shows you here the Marine is sitting very close to the frontal armor, and all of these things, all these connections are kind of keeping him alive in his seat, and that's kind of the combat range for him. So, talking about this, what they're armed with and how to counter or kill them. General counters are going to be mobility, isolation, exhaustion, and range. Now, for mobility, obviously a lot of Dreadnoughts can ambulate with some amount of speed, but none of them are super quick. Even the Contemptor, when it runs, it has some of the issues that Tactical Dreadnought or Terminator armor has, where it can overbalance itself, it can be a little bit clunky, it can be hard to control, and because it has more mobility and flexibility, it can be easier to maybe trip it up, or make it fall, or have any of those issues. They can get themselves back up, but that mobility thing is definitely something you want to take into account, especially when a Dreadnought might have limited range, and you want to get away or run and hit at a Dreadnought over and over again. You'll be able to do that. Isolation. Dreadnoughts are generally deployed in squads or groups. So, not squads or groups of Dreadnoughts, but rather squads of Marines protecting the Dreadnought or helping him out, or the Dreadnought is helping them out. So, isolating the Dreadnought or killing the little Marines first and then going after the Dreadnought is a pretty solid idea. Why? Because the Marines' one job is to kill anyone with weapons capable of killing the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought's job is to protect the Marines. So, like we talked about a little bit ago with Tyranids, you know, the monster tactics, you want to kill the little guys first to try and isolate the Dreadnought. The other thing you want to try and do is, if you can, you want to try and lure the Marines to an area where the Dreadnought can't go. Because they are bigger, because they weigh a ton more, and because they have limitations in their flexibility, there are places that a Dreadnought simply will not fit, but a Marine will. For example, sewers. For example, inside of bunkers or protected areas. A Dreadnought might not fit, but the Marines will. So, drawing off all of the Marines into the bunker or into anywhere else, into somewhere where the Dreadnought can't go, and then assaulting the Dreadnought, or, as they're probably going to leave people behind, drawing off Marines into a place where the Dreadnought can't go and support them, killing those Marines, and then going out to fight the now smaller number of enemies. Exhaustion. Dreadnoughts can go back to sleep. Now, once they're roused, they're not going to pass out on their own, but giving them time, giving them gaps between fights, might cause an especially old Dreadnought to pass out or fall asleep. Also, catching them unawares, like I said before, going on to a chapter homeworld or onto a ship that you know has a Dreadnought on it, and catching the Dreadnought unaware, that might catch them not only asleep, but also might catch them before their equipment is correctly installed, so before their arms and legs have essentially been screwed into place and prepared. The last thing is range. Most Dreadnought weapons have decent range, but a lot of vehicle weapons can outrange them, not to mention artillery weapons that dramatically outrange them. So, outranging or overmatching the Dreadnought's range is a solid way to knock them out. For example, if you have a bunch of tanks, you would want to put them at the absolute maximum range of their guns effectively, and then fire on the Dreadnought. If the Dreadnought doesn't have a las cannon, or if his anti-tank weapons are relatively short range, like a plasma cannon or a melta cannon, he's probably going to have to run at you or run away, because he can't hit you from where he is, and your guns have a chance to kill him without him killing you. So very important. Armament encounters for Castaferum and its modifications. So, the Castaferum almost always has a twin-linked heavy weapons. The most common one is twin-linked heavy bolters. Though things like rotor cannons, assault cannons also exist. The rotational weapons tend to be only single-barreled. But things like doubled-up las cannons, doubled-up melta cannons, any of these are absolutely capable. And it gives them that tank-level weaponry without needing to try all that hard. Now, another one that they have is missile pods, which are pretty common. They are Hellfire rockets. They're pretty solid. They can do both armor-piercing and high-explosive. Their other weapons are close combat weapons. Now, these are claws or fists. The claws for the Castaferum are not necessarily lightning claws. I see this a lot, this confusion about, like, oh, it's either lightning claws or a power fist. I think the claws for the Castaferum are not really designed to be lightning claws. They're never shown as being able to rake or to scratch like lightning claws are. They're much more of like big old industrial scissors. So it's a grab and snip type of motion, rather than a raking, a clawing, or a slashing. Because the Castaferum has such limited mobility in its arms, these claws are designed to grab a target, whether it be the side of a vehicle or an enemy marine, lift them up, and essentially snip them into 4 even pieces with servos. The other option is the fist. Now, the fist also has 4 little stubby fingers, which can be used to grab people and spin them around, or crush them, or throw things. I know there is a recent thing with a Dreadnought picking up a large statue and throwing it at a vehicle. I think that's a little bit silly, but I understand how that's cool. But I'm not going to canonize it because I think that is ridiculously silly. But in general, the claws of the fist, they're more mechanical. However, I have seen examples where the fist has a power field around it, and it is not impossible to say that you couldn't electrify the claws. So while they don't have to be power weapons, it is absolutely possible to make them power weapons. On that extra hand, that melee hand, and it might be both hands as well, you might get both twin-linked heavy weapons or both close combat weapons. It's a little bit less common to get close combat weapons on the Castaferum because they have very limited range of motion and they're a little bit slow and clunky. You get a Stormbolter, a Heavy Flamer, or a Flamer, depending on the version. And that essentially acts as an anti-infantry weapon if their other ranged weapon on their other arm is not designed for anti-infantry. So, if there's a bunch of low-level chaff units like garbage uninitiated cultists, you're not going to want to use your missile launcher or even necessarily your rotor cannon on them. They might be far away, they might be in different areas, but targeting them with a flamer and just kind of going loose, or having a Stormbolter that you can take like a couple of bursts at them with, they can be pretty accurate because they are controlled essentially entirely by Mind Impulse unit, a little bit like a Knight is. Some of them have arm motions or like mobility for the Marine, but in general, it's like it says here, there's just a big old stick into the back of the Marine's brain, and they control the Dreadnought directly via Mind Impulse unit, which, you know, reads your brain like Power Armor does, and then does what you think it should do. The other thing I didn't mention as well is that isolation and exhaustion also include ammunition. While Dreadnoughts can carry a great deal of ammunition with them in their shoulder plates, essentially, they can run out, like any tank does, and because the Dreadnought is so big and so complicated, it actually has less room for storing ammunition than an armored vehicle does, so they can run out of ammo. That's another great way to kind of weaken them. The other thing is that on standard, they have a refractor shield. While the Contemptor, the Castaferum, some Hellbrutes, and a lot of the other ones, like the Redemptor and the Telemon and stuff, they will have refractor fields. The Leviathan, Deredeo, and some of the Telemons have automantic shielding. Now, what's the difference? We've talked about refractor fields before, how they take a ton of power, they project a shield at, essentially, at their own decision, at their own choice, and project this field to protect you from incoming damage. Now, this isn't a thing of like, oh, it's going to come on and off randomly. No, it detects with your auspex when something lethal is coming in, even if you don't see it, and it will expand, break, or destroy, or block whatever it is, and then turn back off again, and it'll take a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes to turn back on. It has a pretty long cooldown, and it takes a ton of energy. The best way to counter these is range and heavy weapons. So using tanks, using lots of heavy weapons, and then keeping at a distance. There are examples of Dreadnoughts running towards armored vehicles and just kind of crushing them. Those vehicles should not be that close. 120mm Lehman Russ battle cannon does not need to be within 500 meters to kill the Dreadnought. It doesn't need to be within 50 meters either. I see these tank commanders running at the Dreadnought like, dude, your gun way outranges his, rotor cannon or whatever it is. Just use the main gun. So, yeah, range, keeping a good distance, backing up slowly as the Castaferum kind of waddles towards you at its best pace, and then hosing it down with fire and waiting for the refractor shield to cycle, hit it again afterwards, break your way through, kill the Marine. The Contemptor. The Contemptor usually has twin-linked heavy weapons. The best example of this that is a bit of odd one is the Conversion Beamer. Conversion Beamer works really weirdly. It's one of those Archaeotech weapons. Kind of works a little bit like a mix between the Gravity Gun and the Disintegrator. If somebody wants me to go into that in way detail, I will, but the Conversion Beamers are super rare, so pretty much just the older versions of the Contemptor will have that, along with the Automantic Shielding. This is kind of like an Arcane Refractor Field. It works a little bit better, takes a lot more energy, but it's kind of more consistent, and it can reload quicker. On the other hand, not all Contemptors have that. They generally have lighter linked heavy weapons, so something like a pair of las cannons or a pair of heavy bolters is a little bit more common, as opposed to the very heavy weapons that can be on the Castaferum. They also tend to have weapons that have a ball joint or a gimbal. Their close combat weapons are definitely actual power weapons. Matter of fact, there are some Contemptors that have real power weapons, like power swords, thunder hammers, things of that nature, built into their structure, as a big version of a power weapon. Some of them also have a secondary chain weapon in addition to these close combat weapons, so they might have claws and a chain blade, or claws and a pair of heavy bolters, either built into their hands, like that last one, or one arm has two heavy bolters, the other arm has claws. The best counters to this are absolutely dumping on them with heavy weapons. The Contemptor is a lot less armored than the Castaferum, or basically any of the other ones except for the Hellbrute. It has a ton more weak spots. It is more attenuated. A lot more of its joints are exposed. While it is heavily enough protected that basic infantry weapons aren't going to do anything to it, heavy weapons like heavy bolters, or high armor piercing weapons like las cannons, or heavy armor piercing versions of bolt rounds like Kraken rounds, those might do something to it, but your best option here is it takes less shots to kill it with something like a las cannon, so you want to use something like a las cannon, take your best possible opportunity. On the other hand, it has a better refractor field in the automantic shielding, and it's a lot faster, so if you don't hit the first hit, unlike the Castaferum, you're not going to have a good chance to do it again. So something with a little bit full auto, or a little bit heavier gauge protection so you can fire more quickly, las cannons that are super well cooled, or auto cannons that are high caliber, those would be the best thing to use against the Contemptor, and even then, you're going to have to crush through a lot of the actual protection and get through the Arcane Refractor Field in order to actually damage the darn thing. In which case, you better be on a vehicle, because that Contemptor is coming with a vengeance, and they are not very friendly. A lot of these, by the way, also have chest-mounted weapons. I don't go into them in detail because a lot of them are just heavy bolters, or bolters, something like that. I went into them with the Leviathan, though. That does have Volkite. Hellbrutes. So, These usually either have a single heavy, so like a single heavy autocannon, or paired weapons like heavy bolters or some missile launcher, things like that. The other option that they have for melee weapons are lasher claws, lasher tendrils, and fists. Their fists are basically exactly like the Castiferums. Some of them have the Redemptor kind of mini mittened, like nubbed hand where they can grab stuff, but they also have the kind of classic attenuated skeleton claws or like chain claws, which are very cool. I recommend anyone look up that art because it's incredible, the old-fashioned Hellbrutes. I wish that was still the model that they had, but it was kind of terrible, and also the only version they had of it was in metal. And I should have bought that when I had a chance. But the Hellbrutes generally have a little bit of an easier time, or you have a little bit of an easier time killing them. The best counter to them is heavy vehicle or artillery weapons, and you might say, well, that's a lot more than you were talking about before. The real reason is because Hellbrutes have worse protection outright. The fleshy growth, the chaos corruption of the actual chassis means that it's not working along standard, real-world tank lines anymore. It's not, using an engine and protecting itself with layered power or pulling its machinery with this. No, there's none of that. It's chaos. It's using demon power and the flesh of its user as the muscle and bone in place of the metal and servos that are moving a standard Dreadnought. So the Hellbrute may be more flexible, way more messed up, capable of things that a normal Dreadnought wouldn't in terms of like movement and speed. For being the design of the Castiferum, it can move pretty quickly. The other thing is some of it can have odd weapons. So in Space Marine 2, for example, they have these big old gravity hammers. That's totally possible because Hellbrutes are kind of constructed and a lot of their weapons are belted on after the fact. They can be equipped with a lot of different stuff, but their armor is cracked, it has flesh showing, and there's a lot of more places where it can be wounded, and of course the actual bay where the marine or the creature inside is inhabiting isn't as well protected as a standard Dreadnought, so killing it is a little bit easier and can be done with less direct, precise weaponry, which is why I mark heavy vehicle or artillery weapons. The other thing about Hellbrutes, when I say that they are psychotic, I really do mean it. When they're stored awake and alone, essentially stuck behind a field that protects them from demons, but very little else, and they don't have arms or legs, so they sit there stewing in their own hatred and fury for weeks, if not months, if not years, before they get back on track. And then they're essentially given their weapons and equipment and pushed out of the ship to go and mess stuff up. That's their only job. If the Hellbrute spends itself and dies in the attempt, killing a bunch of Marines, that was it. That's all they needed. It's not like a Venerable where they need to worry about getting him back. It's one shot. If they come back, they come back. We'll kind of corral them back on and see if we can get them to black out so we can take their weapons away. But in the meantime, until their energy runs out and their anger has spent its course, nobody's getting in its way, friend or foe. Dreadnoughts, they have heavy range weapons. These are either paired, quad, and then they also have lots of rockets and stuff. And they also have chest weapons, usually heavy bolters. They use auto shields, those arcane automatic shielding, but they're also equipped to do a lot of different things. So obviously they can perform a support role like a mobile anti-air weapon, but they can also perform actual anti-air. They can perform anti-tank. They can do, stationary gun things, but on the move. And the best counter to them is large close combat weapons. Getting another Dreadnought that has a melee combat weapon will mess them up. Getting a Knight to go against them will mess them up. Getting in really close to these guys, you might get stepped on, but in the meantime, there's not really usually any melee weapons to worry about with the Dreadnoughts, so go nuts. If you have a melt-a-gun, or if you have explosive charges or something, stick them to the legs. There's really not much stopping you once you get within the arc of the weapon, and, it can be dangerous. It is obviously dangerous to approach a Dreadnought, but the Dreadnought specifically has some serious limitations in where it can fire. It has to rotate itself much like an anti-aircraft platform, and you can get within its legs and within its range pretty easily if you're sneaky enough. It has auspex, it can figure out where you are, but enough of you with enough explosives get close. You won't have to worry about a big old claw grabbing you and killing you. The Leviathan, they have super heavy and exotic weapons, along with Grav, Plasma, Volkite, and Automatic Shieldings. Your best option for the Leviathan is getting a super heavy vehicle weapon. So, a Leviathan will kill a majority of other lesser Dreadnoughts. It's a little bit of more of an even fight between it and the Redemptor. But in general, the Leviathan has a lot of advantages over its fellows. It has advantages over other tanks and armored vehicles, so you definitely want to not be close to it, and you want to try your best to get a super heavy weapon or a very heavy artillery strike to try and kill it. And even then, the Leviathan is very durable. It has a lot of armor and protection, it has a lot of layered protection, and it has automatic shielding, so it's one of the most durable Dreadnoughts out there. Good luck. Super heavy options are your best option. The Redemptor. It is that upgraded, modernized Castaferum. So it can have bigger plasma weapons. It can have bigger bolt weapons. It can have a lot of different add-on weapons, including some strange melee weapons. Your best option is to limit its mobility. Because it has longer limbs and because it is so overtaxed power-wise, causing it to run a great distance, forcing it to make a lot of movements that it doesn't want to, say, fighting in an urban environment, will counter it a lot more. And you would want to aim on the Redemptor for its power system, because if you can damage the power system, the Redemptor will have a much harder time running on low power than something like a Castaferum would. Obviously, if you deny any of these of power, they will not be able to move. But the Redemptor specifically, because it is so much more material being moved around, it's so much heavier, without any real change in the original power pack, it is stretching itself dramatically, and using that to your best advantage is definitely a good option. The last one's the Telemon, Dreadknights, Walkers, and Proto-Dreads. The Telemon is its own thing. The Telemon and the Custodes Dreads, along with the regular Custodes stuff. I'll talk about Custodes at some point. But all of them use similar to standard Dreadnought weapons. A lot of them have special or exotic weaponry, and most of them have automatic shielding, but they're essentially replacing Ceramite with Auramite, which is just more powerful Ceramite. It is... Auramite is to Ceramite what Adamantium is to steel. So, double increased, much stronger. Dreadknights and Walkers, these both have a normal, healthy Marine inside of a knight-like carapace. A Walker mech covering that, in the case of the Dreadnought and some of the Walkers, doesn't actually protect the person in the middle all that much. Without shielding, they are exposed. So while they all have, minor weapons and exotics, they have a lot of secondaries, things like that, and the Dreadnought is obviously psychic. The big disadvantage of the Dreadknights, the Walkers, and the Proto-Dreads is the pilot is not as well protected as in any other Dreadnought, because the pilot is generally a living, working Marine who's going to be in their protection, or, human, or whatever it is. So, the goal with them is, if you can kill the pilot, go for it. And that's generally the thing with the Dreadknights and the Walkers. While they will be protected, either with shields, mobility, or whatever it is, even personal body armor, they are going to always be less protected than trying to take down the actual vehicle itself. The exception to that being the Telemon, which is a far more traditional Dreadnought that has just been upgraded with different equipment and protection. Woo! Goodness, that was a long one, and this is getting long. I intended to do 2 tonight. I will do my best. Users, importance, and logistics. We have over here some of the Proto-Dreadnoughts, a Psyker Dreadnought with a force weapon, very cool. His squishy little Castaferum claws. This is another one. See what I was talking about? I think these can be set up as power weapons. This is clearly a lightning field instead of a kinetic field. And he has an assault cannon as well. And then the Dreadnought. So, the Dreadnought has a lot of specialty psychic weapons, including swords, psychic cannons, all that kind of stuff. But you can see here as well, his head is exposed, so are his legs, so are his arms. He's controlling it like it's a mech, but he's not within the protection. While he does have a shield around him, obviously a psychic shield as well as a refractor shield, it would probably be easier to push through that than to actually try and kill this darn thing. So, users, Marines, as we've been talking about this entire video, proto-humans, they use these almost like we would think of mechs today in our world. Something like a giant human-operated skid loader like from Aliens. These existed during the Dark Age of technology. They were around during the Imperium's early days during the Unification Wars. And they did exist on other planets. Some of them became Dreadnought patterns. Some of those designs eventually went on to become Space Marine power armor patterns. For Xenos, there are some things that you could call this. Obviously, the Eldar have some things where they meld a body of an Eldari into the body of a creature, into the body of a tank, or into the body of a Titan. But those are much more on the field of Titans than they are on the field of Dreadnoughts. The only example that I could really think of is some of the Wraithguard, but those are clearly not exactly the same thing. The other ones I would give you are some of the Mecha Knobs and the Orc Dreadnoughts, kind of. Something like a Death Dread might be similar to this, but those are always going to be made out of standard steel instead of ceramite, so they are going to be less protected, and most of them favor melee weapons over ranged weapons, so the Dreadnought will have an advantage on them in most situations. Specialty units, like we talked about here, there's a lot of the kind of special, super unique ones, including the Dreadnought. How to supply them. On the field, you want to use a Dreadnought until it's run a little bit through half of its ammo and then call them back for resupply. Resupplying a Dreadnought in the field would be very difficult. You would definitely need a Tech Priest around to do it, and it would need some serious solitude to make sure that there isn't someone who can take you unawares. So in general, you want to do it in a place where you're safe. Who makes them? The Adeptus Mechanicus make these. And also the Dark Mechanicus, obviously. There is a solid chance that some of the Traitor Legions make them, but again, we don't see them very often because the use cases for a Marine in the Loyalist forces to use them is a lot more common, even though it is uncommon, than it is for a Chaos force to want a Dreadnought. Are they custom? Yes, the Chapter 1s are straight up custom. The coloring is custom. A lot of the Venerable Dreadnoughts have special stuff done to them to make them special. Sometimes this is done by the Forge World. They'll make willing modifications if it's a important enough Marine, a previous Chapter Master, something like that. But if it's just a standard Marine in the Dreadnought, he might be like, hey, brother so-and-so, I would really appreciate it if I didn't look like a standard Dreadnought. I would really like, maybe some purity seals. I would like some inlay done here. I would like my name somewhere. I don't want to look so out of place. I want to look like you guys. And it is kind of a sad thing of Dreadnoughts. A lot of them want to be like their brothers. A lot of them feel kind of cheated that they're stuck inside of this machine. And then we went over how they get deployed and when a little bit in detail. Sorry. A lot of these are coming back to themselves because I'm making multiple videos at the same time. New videos, soon 3 in the pipeline. Enjoy your memes. I'm sorry, a lot of them are very, very bit mashed. But the 3 videos coming down the line, I have this Armory video done now. And then I have 2 more Armies videos coming soon. Soon as in either today or tomorrow. I'm sorry I made you guys wait so long, but I am glad to have gotten this out of the way. Thank you to everyone who voted for Armory, and the next vote will be coming after the other 2 videos are done, and I wish you all a wonderful good night.